Welcome to a review of food chains and food webs and trophic levels. So just looking at these words, producers and consumers, you can just go back to basic things like economics and things. So what things in our environment produce and which ones consume. So there's only actually a few organisms that actually produce. What do they produce? They produce their own food. Well, how do they do that? And then consumers, so what you need to be thinking is what are primary consumers, like first consumers, secondary, and what are the heck are tertiary consumers. So plants are producers, so they produce their own food through photosynthesis using sunlight and carbon dioxide and make sugars. Also, don't forget the lowly algae and bacteria that will also go through photosynthesis. So just a friendly reminder, a lot of times people think of a chain. This organism eats this organism, eats this organism, but really it's more of a web. And so there's a lot of interactions between many different organisms, and trying to look at the big picture is sometimes challenging, but just to let you know, you are very important to the survival of the system, no matter what role you play. So think about being conservative. So we've heard food chains and food webs, and they describe kind of the same idea. So just a review, but when one organism consumes another so that they can survive or their offspring can survive. And so a food web is more accurate than a food chain, since there's lots of different organisms that are interacting, and it's very rare to have one organism, say maybe the koala bear only eats bamboo, but there's tends to be, if you think about a wolf, actually will eat several different types of organisms and not just one. Again, reviewing. The producers are the very beginning of the food chain or food web. So they're at the very bottom of, you can think about a trophic pyramid. So these are the very bottom. They produce lots and lots of energy. Basically, all the energy that is consumed in the ecosystem is first produced by producers, plants, but also bacteria and protists, algae. So all the energy comes from the sun, and plants are ones who make food with that energy through photosynthesis. And again, remember that formula. So you have light energy, you have water coming in through the roots, you have CO2 coming in through the leaves, and it yields or produces C6H12O6 glucose, plus the byproduct that the plant doesn't need, oxygen, because thankfully we do. Also, one more term I want you to remember is the autotroph. And remember, auto means by itself, so autotroph, these are the only organisms that make food on their own. So we need to know autotroph and producers. So as the name indicates, consumers consume, and they're the next food link in the food chain or the food web. And again, you need to be able to differentiate the three different levels of consumers. So with consumers, I also want you to remember another term. So heterotroph. So remember, hetero means different or not the same. So you're getting energy from some other source. So primary means like first. Sometimes we call elementary the primary school. So it's the first level of education. So these are the first level of consumers in an ecosystem. Sometimes they're also called first order. So these are the worms, insects, squirrels, mice. These are all the organisms that eat the plant, or also think the microorganisms like algae and bacteria. So we call these herbivores if they eat plants or plant-like substances. And like squirrels eat acorns, and mice might eat little hay or something. And think worms, they don't necessarily eat a plant, but they eat part of the residue, the breakdown of plants. Secondary consumers, sometimes again, second order, these are the carnivores, you've heard of that. These are also heterotrophs. They eat the primary consumers, so a cat would eat a squirrel or a cat would eat a mouse. And the tertiary, these can eat the primary and secondary consumers. So a wolf can eat a cat or a squirrel or a mouse. And you'll notice too, as we kind of move up, it's not always, but a lot of the tertiary consumers are larger, more complex organisms. So omnivores eat both plants and animals, meat. They can be either primary or secondary consumers. So then now the question is, where do humans fall in this whole trophic level? And you've heard the word scavengers. They eat the remains of dead organisms left by consumers. So vultures, coyotes, hyenas. So decomposers. These are the little guys, the little champions of the ecosystem or the food web that we kind of overlook a lot of times. So these are the lowly bacteria and different types of fungus, and they make it possible for really the circle of life, the food web, to actually work. So if you die, they eat you, little reviews. If you poop, they eat that. Yes, nice and gross, and you'll remember it. If you lose a leaf, they eat that too. So whenever something that was alive dies, it decomposes. And again, it recycles these nutrients. So without the decomposers, without this link in the chain and the circle, the ecosystem does not work. So the decomposers, again, return the nutrients, especially nitrogen, back into the soil. Producers can use this nutrients and elements once it's in the soil in a usable form, and decomposers complete the system, turning essential molecules to the producers, who then create their own energy, and then other organisms, the primaries, eat them, the herbivores, the tier 1s, then the tier 2s eat those, the tier 3s might eat those, and then the tertiary ones die and they're decomposed, and they keep going on, circle, circle, circle. Cool, fictitious food web, Mr. Heflin. Thanks. So, if you had something like this, or a smaller one like this, you need to be able to identify which ones are the producers, decomposers, consumers, tertiary consumers. So this one's set up so it's pretty easy to recognize, but obviously the names are all changed on purpose. But so we have all of these plant-like organisms and bacteria. Don't forget the bacteria and algae. These all are use photosynthesis. So this level are the producers. And you can think of this as a big pyramid, the trophic levels, or you can just think of it as a web. So these are the producers. They use sunlight to produce energy in the form of glucose. They store that typically in the roots as starch. And so then the next level, these are the consumers. So what do they consume? They consume the producers, the plants. And so if they just eat plants, we call these primary consumers. We can also call these herbivores. So notice the arrows. So the rots can eat several different plants. The rits just eat a few, and the rangums just eat some of the algae, or the dusters. Now we have the secondary consumers. What the secondary consumers consume? They consume the smaller, typically smaller, primary consumers. So the SARs can eat the RITs, and then the Sullies can eat the RITs and the Ruttids. And then we have the tertiary, or the top organisms. Again, these tend to be, but not always, larger and more complex. So humans can eat lots of different organisms. The nuggets can eat just a primary and a secondary. But then what I want you to notice also, then at the bottom are the decomposers. So all these organisms, whether they're producers, primary, secondary, tertiary consumers, they all in the end get broken down by the decomposers. So now we're just showing you a different image diagram of a food web, really. So ecological pyramid and the energy that contains in each level of the food web. So here you've seen a pyramid, and we've talked about trophic levels. So same thing over here. And what I want you to look at is just how much energy is contained in the producers. So again, we take it for granted. So all the trees and plants, but think about grass. We have miles and miles of grass, hundreds and thousands of acres of corn and beans. So how much energy is actually contained in those organisms? A lot. Now think about how much energy then gets transferred, let's say, into a cow that's eating the corn. And then how much energy is transferred then into a person eating the cow. And when you're doing the math, when you're looking at this very closely, look at these numbers, you see a pattern, and then your math teacher would say, what percent gets transferred from one level to the next? And your answer would be, I'm going to let you figure that on your own. And then let's say you're going to work for the UN, and you travel to Kenya, someplace in Africa or India, and you need to set up an agricultural system, and you're asked, do you design a system that identifies plants and growing lots of plants for the population to eat, or do you design a system to raise, let's say, chickens, pigs, goats, and cows to be consumed by the population? And I want you just to jot down some things, pros and cons for each system, given all this information you've learned in this video and reviewed. So this is just more looking at an aquatic ecological pyramid. So we're just looking at the biomass. So really, if you took all these organisms and they're all dehydrated, there's no water in their system, and then you weighed them out, this would be the number of organisms, the mass of the organisms. So we can see again, we have a lot of primary producers, and then we have consumers, secondary, and then tertiary. And the question is, what things would be tertiary consumers in the ocean?